Well, friends, welcome back to Q on Q and Happy New Year. If you are listening to this when it first airs, we are just a few days into 2026. Man, where did that time go? It just feels like last year flew by. It's like we blinked and 12 months were gone. And we are coming near a big milestone for us. We have arrived at episode 99 of the Q on Q podcast. Today, we're going to wrap up our four-part series about the seasons in our lives. Remember, these aren't neat categories, but lived realities. Let me give you a quick recap if you have not had the chance to tune in. We started in winter. We talked about sitting with waiting and learning how growth can happen even when nothing seems to be changing. We moved on to spring, where hope and momentum returned and new life began to take shape. And then we stepped into summer last time, recognizing abundance, fruitfulness, and the responsibility that comes with fullness. Now remember, each season has carried its own weight, its own questions, and its own invitations. You know, a lot of times when I put together everything for these podcasts, it gives me a hard reality about something in my own life. That has been especially true with this series. I've reflected on times of waiting, when I was in winter, when I wasn't sure what was next, but I had to trust God was growing something beneath the surface. Then there were times of spring, when I saw growth begin to come to the surface, and summer, when I felt like I was in times of everything going right. Growth was taking place, and everything was firing on all cylinders. And before we get into today's season, this one might be the hardest for me personally, and I think for a lot of us, because admittedly, things are a lot different for us right now, and there's a lot of great things happening. My job responsibilities have shifted this school year. I'm doing more work with writing and composing and spending time with family and engaged in some side projects I had wanted to tackle for a while. That's what makes this topic a hard one to talk about. That's because seasons don't live in theory, they show up every day in our routines. They are a part of our relationships. They exist in our inner conversations. Bringing real life into this space matters because it reminds us that none of this is abstract. It's all happening right now. Autumn is a season that often arrives without much fanfare. It doesn't demand our attention the way the other ones do. It seems to slip in quietly, marked by subtle changes, a shift in priorities, maybe things slowing down a bit, or maybe even a growing sense that something is winding down. This season can feel uncomfortable. It can feel bittersweet, especially when what's changing is something that seems to be good. I'll be the first to admit that when everything's going great, when we fall into that comfortable routine, when it seems like things can't get any better, even the slightest change can throw us for a loop, especially when it's related to those good things not being as prominent in our lives anymore. But we need to realize this season, autumn, is not a season of failure or loss. It's a season of wisdom. It invites us to notice what has run its course, to honor what has been fruitful, to release what no longer fits the season we're entering. Perfect visuals just to think about the trees that we see as the autumn season enters every year. Those beautiful green leaves change to even more beautiful colors. And they remind us that letting go is not giving up. It's preparing. It's how space is made for rest, reflection, and eventually renewal. So as we begin this final episode in the series, my hope is that you will listen gently and listen honestly. Pay attention for what resonates with you. Maybe something will stir within you, and something might even feel familiar. There may already be places in your life where autumn has started, places where you've been invited to loosen your grip, or trust a transition, or believe that release is not the end of the story. But friends, it's how the story continues. As the title says, I like to think of autumn as a season of release. Autumn is the season where change becomes unavoidable. The light shifts, the pace slows, and what once felt full begins to thin out. In life, Autumn often arrives when we sense that something is no longer meant to continue in the same way, even if it was once good or meaningful or life giving. This season asks us to pay attention to those quiet signals instead of ignoring them or rushing past them. Think about how nature releases during the season. I mentioned about the trees already. Trees don't cling to their leaves out of fear, they let go of them because the season requires it. If we don't get those colorful leaves that eventually let go and fall to the ground, we'll never get new leaves for the following year. In the same way, autumn in our lives invites us to release roles or let go of routines or expectations or identities that no longer fit who we are becoming. It isn't about loss for its own sake, it's about making room. And holding on too tightly can prevent us from entering what's next with clarity and peace. Autumn's a season of honesty. It brings clarity about what has run its course and what still has life in it. This clarity can feel uncomfortable, especially when it challenges our plans or things we're attached to. But there's a wisdom in acknowledging when a chapter is ending. Release doesn't erase the value of what came before, it honors it by recognizing its completion. I think a major defining element of the season of autumn is transition. Transition sits between fullness and stillness. Or think of it this way, it sits between times of abundance and times of rest. This in between space can feel uncertain sometimes, even disorienting. We might not yet know what winter will require of us, but autumn prepares us by slowing down and inviting reflection. It teaches us that transition itself is a season, not something to rush through, but something to experience fully. In some sense, autumn carries a sense of maturity. It's less about growth and more about discernment. Instead of asking, what can I add? The question becomes, what can I release? This shift in perspective marks a deepening of wisdom because it's a season that values quality over quantity. It's a time that values depth over busyness, and a time we need to focus on intention over momentum. Ultimately, autumn reminds us that release is not an ending, it's a form of preparation. Letting go, I know it's hard, but it allows us to move forward lighter, clearer, and more attentive to what truly matters. When we honor this season for what it is, we begin to see that release is not something to fear, but something that makes room for renewal in the seasons ahead. Let's look at this from a spiritual perspective. Autumn is often where trust is tested and deepened. Releasing something familiar to us, even something good, often requires faith. It asks us to believe that God is at work, not only in what's beginning, but also in what's ending. Ecclesiastes reminds us that to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. Recognizing the right season is itself an act of wisdom, one that draws us closer to God rather than far away. One of the most challenging spiritual truths of autumn is that God sometimes asks us to let go fully before we understand what comes next. This can kind of be unsettling, especially for those of us who value clarity and direction. Yet, Scripture consistently shows that God often works through release and pruning. Jesus talks about this in John 15, where he talks about branches that are pruned not to harm them, but to allow them to bear more fruit. Think of it with your own plants. A lot of them that are perennials that come up year after year, you don't just cut them completely off or dig them out of the ground, you trim them to allow them to regrowth and have new generation. Letting go in this sense isn't abandonment, it's preparation. Autumn invites us to examine our attachments. Sometimes what we hold on to is no longer rooted in calling or obedience, but in comfort, fear, or habit. Philippians 3:13 says, "Forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead." This isn't about erasing the past, it's about refusing to let it define or limit the future God is unfolding right before you. And a lot of times that leads to surrender. Because unlike seasons of activity or growth, this season is one where obedience is quieter. It might involve fewer visible wins and more internal alignment. It means trusting that God sees the whole picture, even when we only see what we're releasing. It's us learning to say, this mattered, this was good, and I trust what comes next. This season is one that no matter how hard it might be for us, it's one that deepens, probably more than the others, our awareness of dependence on God. Because when something ends or changes, it can expose how much we relied on it for identity or security or even validation. This exposure is not meant to shame us, but to re anchor us. Because seasons of release often draw us back to God as our constant, the one who remains when circumstances shift and roles change. Ultimately, the spiritual work of autumn is learning to let go with open hands rather than clenched fists. It's trusting that God is just as present in the releasing as he was in the receiving. And when we honor this season spiritually with prayer, honesty, and humility, we discover that autumn is not the weakening of faith, but more of a refinement. So, how can we apply this whole idea of release in a practical way? Because this topic is one thing to talk about, but something else when we face it in real life. Well, the fact is, release becomes real when it moves from reflection to action. This season isn't just a feeling, it's something that we practice. One of the first practical expressions of autumn is evaluation, because we have to honestly assess what we're carrying, our commitments, our routines, our responsibilities, and ask ourselves which of these still align with who we are becoming, and which ones are we maintaining simply because they've always been there. Another expression of release is learning to say no with clarity and grace. Boy, is this a hard one. You want to be there for everybody and you want to be able to do everything and help in every way possible. But this season invites us to stop overextending ourselves in the name of loyalty, in the name of productivity, or the fear of disappointing others. Saying no is not a failure of commitment. I want to say that again. Saying no is not a failure of commitment. It's often an act of discernment. Because when we release what no longer fits, we create room. We create a margin. Not emptiness, but space that allows us to breathe, reflect, and prepare for what's next. Because release often shows up in letting go of outdated versions of ourselves. This can be one of the hardest aspects of this season. We might no longer need the identity that once protected us, or even motivated us, or defined us in a previous season. Growth sometimes requires releasing who we were so we can step more fully into who we are becoming. Honoring past versions of yourself while allowing them to pass is a profound act of faith and self compassion. Autumn is a season of simplifying. It might mean reducing your busyness, streamlining your schedule, or minimizing distractions that keep you from being present. Simplification is not about doing less for the sake of less, it's about doing more with intention. It's about doing what matters. This season asks us to choose depth over volume. We need to choose clarity over noise. Because what about the emotional release we feel when we do that? There might be disappointment, maybe unmet expectations, or for some of us, even grief. Giving yourself permission to feel these emotions without rushing past them is part of faithful release. Grieving what was doesn't mean you lack faith. It means you honor the significance of what mattered. And emotional honesty then allows healing to begin. It might lead to creating new rhythms that support reflection and rest. Maybe it's journaling or walking or prayer or simply carving out quiet moments to listen. This is a season where silence can be instructive, helping us discern what truly needs our attention moving forward. And talking about moving forward, release is about trust in the motion that you're going to experience because it's choosing to loosen your grip even when the next step isn't clear. You don't have to force resolution or clarity. The work of this season is preparation. You notice I didn't say the work of this season is answers, it's preparation. Because when we release with intent and care, we position ourselves to enter the next season more ready, lighter, and wiser, and more attuned to the leading God is giving us. And yeah, every season of release carries a story, and autumn is no different. This is where that abstract that I talked about becomes tangible, it becomes something real, because transition shows up in your real everyday decisions, in your emotions, and in your moments of surrender. A story from this season doesn't need to be dramatic or neatly resolved. Often the most powerful stories of release are quiet ones. Choosing not to fight for something anymore, or recognizing when a chapter is closing, or simply acknowledging that life is asking for a different posture than it once did. You might think about a time when you had to let go of something that mattered, not because it was wrong, but because it was finished. It might have been a role or position you were in, a relationship you had, or even a version of yourself that no longer fit. Well, autumn stories often live in the tension between gratitude and grief. We're thankful for what was, yet aware that holding on would prevent growth. It's in these times that we become sort of our greatest testimonies in life. Those testimonies don't always need to be focused on details. The heart of the story is the process. What it felt like to recognize the need for release, or what resistance surfaced, and what trust looked like in that moment. People don't need a perfect ending. They want to see reality and honesty and truthfulness. They need to know that letting go is rarely clean or easy, but it can still be faithful. There might be fear of the unknown, fear of regret, fear of loss. Naming that fear gives us permission to acknowledge our own fear. And autumn reminds us that courage doesn't always look like you're moving forward boldly. Sometimes it looks like you're just loosening the grip and trusting God with what you can't carry anymore. Our stories bear witness. They say, "This was hard," or they say, "This mattered to me." And they certainly say, "I chose to trust anyway." That kind of story doesn't just connect, it allows us to see our connections with grace rather than shame, and with hope rather than fear. Well, as we are nearing the end today, I want to offer you a few action steps, not as pressure, but as practice. I encourage you this week first to name one thing that you know it's time to release. Don't overanalyze it. If something has been surfacing again and again in your thoughts or your prayers, start there. Write it down. Naming it brings clarity, and clarity brings honesty. And then take one small, concrete step towards letting it go. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It might be a conversation, a decision not to recommit or renew, a boundary placed on your time, or simply choosing not to carry that expectation that no longer belongs to you. Remember, release rarely happens all at once. It happens through faithful, repeated steps. And then allow yourself to create space on purpose. Release without space can feel like loss. Choose one way this week to slow down, reflect, or be still. That space isn't empty, it's receptive. It's where God often does his quietest and most meaningful work. So name it, think about something small you can do, and then reflect in the space it creates. If you find yourself in a season of release right now, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not failing and you are not falling behind. If you are holding on to things that seem comfortable to you or recognizable and things you're just afraid of letting go, please know that letting go is not a sign that you missed something or did something wrong or that you're going to be a bad person. Often it's a sign you are paying attention to your limits, to your growth, and to God's quiet leading. Autumn does not diminish your story, it deepens it. And you might feel tension in this season, a pull between what was and what might be. That tension isn't something to rush past or resolve immediately. It's a place where wisdom is forming. And I want you to trust that God is present in the uncertainty, working even when clarity feels just out of reach. Faith in this season is usually less about being certain and more about you staying open. If release feels painful to you, doesn't mean it's wrong. Some of the most faithful decisions come with grief attached. You're allowed to mourn what you're letting go of while still trusting God with what's ahead. Gratitude and sadness can coexist. Both can be expressions of a heart that cares deeply about something. I want you to know, if you feel resistance in this time, you're not alone. Fear, doubt, the urge to cling on to something, those responses are human. God doesn't ask us to release perfectly. He asks us to release honestly. And even small steps matter. You don't need to have the next season figured out to honor this one. Autumn's not about answers, it's about alignment. It's about allowing God to gently loosen what no longer needs to be carried so your hands are free for what comes next. That freedom begins long before you know what you're reaching for. Wherever you are in this process, I want you to know the same God who met you in waiting, in growth and abundance, in all those other seasons, is with you now. This season of release is not the end of the story, it's a turning point. And turning points, though often uncomfortable, are where deep and lasting transformation begins. Well, friends, as we close this series on the seasons in our lives, I hope you leave with this truth. Every season shapes you, and none of them were wasted. Waiting mattered, growth mattered, abundance mattered, and release matters too. Together, they don't form a straight line, but a faithful, God-honoring cycle of becoming. If you're listening to this at the end of one season and the edge of another, know that God is already present in what you haven't stepped into yet. You're not late. You're not behind. You are being prepared. Sometimes through fullness, and sometimes through letting go. Well, this series comes to an end here, but the journey does not. In our next episode, we mark a milestone, episode 100. We're going to take time to reflect on where we've been, talk about what we've learned and what God's currently laying on my heart, and where we're going. And let me just say, I can't be more excited about what I have to share with you next time. So till then, carry this with you, friends. Honor the season you're in, trust the season that's coming, and walk forward with expectancy. That's it for this week's Q on Q. As always, I really do appreciate you tuning in. We'll see you back here next time when we'll have more for you on Q.